All right, good evening, everyone. Pastor Tim here, and we're going to be kicking off our second session in a world religion class. We are going to be digging into the topic of Islam tonight, and as is always the case, as we kick things off here, just going to give people a few minutes to log on and to join us. We'll be going from 7 to 8 tonight, maybe a little bit before 8 we'll wrap up, but looking to dig into the topic of Islam tonight and understanding some of the core tenets of Islam, and then talking about how that compares and contrasts with Christianity. So as you sign on, if you want to leave a comment, let us know where you're watching from. If you're watching from Maine or New Hampshire, Massachusetts, some other place around the world, we have people who are tuning into Bethany Church from really all over. So take a minute when you join us, just leave a comment. Let us know that you're here. Hey, Kelly, thanks for joining us this evening. We're going to, again, last week we did kind of an introduction to world religions. This week we're going to talk about Islam. Next week we're going to delve into the topics of Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism, maybe both, maybe just focus on one. We'll see how that goes. And then also we're going to be looking at kind of the religion of self or New Age spirituality coming up in the future. Good evening, Frank and Diane and Amy as well. Like I said, as you sign on, if you could leave a comment, just let us know that you're watching. That'd be great. And as is always the case, if you give thumbs up and smiley faces and hearts and things like that, it lets Facebook know that people are engaged and they're watching. Feel free to leave comments. Feel free to, ask questions in the process. I did get a question that came in last week, and I'm actually going to start this week by delving into one of the questions that came in last week. And those are 100% anonymous. I won't share those with anybody, but if you have particular questions, I'm glad to bat them around a little bit. Hello, Leslie and Mary and Lynn. Thanks for tuning in this evening and joining us. Looking forward, like I said last week, looking forward to in the near future when we'll be able to gather together again. That'll be nice. Give people probably another minute just to log on here. You may notice my studio looks a little different tonight. I'm actually at the office. Just came back to the office to do some work this evening. So, hey, Leanne, thanks for joining us as well. Good to see you joining us. And we're gonna, like I said, this will be a 4-week class, and then I'm gonna also try to offer you a variety of different resources so you can continue to dig into the topic of world religions and understanding more and more of those things, more and more of the world religions, not just for academic purposes, but also so you can know how to talk to people who are coming from different faiths and different backgrounds. So I'll give people one more minute here as you sign on. Just let us know that you're watching. Hey, Debbie from Cape Ned taking notes. Thanks for taking notes in advance. I don't think I've said anything super interesting so far. So hopefully there's some helpful things that'll be coming down the road. Leanne, I know we were talking before. I got time to sit down and do all my prep, so I think we'll be good to go. Kathy, thanks for joining us as well. Hello, Mr. Welch. Thanks for joining us. If Miss Sally's there, tell her we say hello as well. Let's dig in. Let's jump into our content for this evening, and I'll try to kind of follow the comments here as I watch them and also share a little bit. So we're discussing world religions. I talked last week about kind of where we're going to go this week and the next 2 weeks as well. Our purpose is to gain an understanding of Christianity as a religion and then contrast it with other major world religions. We're not going into the full in-depth dive on all the theology of every religion, let alone Christianity, but we want to get some of the basic tenets of the different world religions and then compare and contrast with Christianity. So we'll do that. Hey, Martha, thanks for joining us as always. So a resource that I recommended last week, World Religions Made Easy by Hendrickson Publishers. This is a book that was published a while ago. So some of the statistics are out of date because as you talk about the growth or the shrinking of the numbers of people involved in different world religions, because it's not updated yet, then some of those numbers are going to be off. But the general tenets and the truths of not just Christianity, but the world religions in this book are very helpful. So it's a great reference guide because it talks about the core of those religions and then gives you some insight into how to think about other world religions contrasting with Christianity. So I want to recommend that to you as a resource again. If you remember last week, we said we have to get a shared definition of religion to understand this topic. And so just to recap quickly, religion is a system of belief and or worship, usually connected to the ideas of God, morality, and the afterlife. So that's was our shared definition as we were digging into the topic. Hey, Brian and Nancy from Newmarket, and also, hey, Marie, thanks for joining us as well. All right, so What a question that came up last week, and I'm rephrasing it. It was a longer question, very well stated, but I want to kind of just tighten it up for the sake of the PowerPoint and sharing tonight. The question was, are people the religion they are just because essentially of where they're born, a particular time and place in the world, right? So if you go to India right now, you're going to see that a lot of people there are Hindu because that's what most people believe. And so if you're born there, you're likely to become a Hindu. If you're born in many parts of Europe now, you're likely to be agnostic because Europe is not community that a place that promotes religion in a huge way. If you're born in China, maybe it's Confucianism, maybe it's some form of ancestor worship or Buddhism, because it's a cultural reality that's dominated by those worldviews or religions. So yes, I think we need to think about this question, and the subtext, the kind of implication as we dig into this question is, if Christianity claims, as Jesus does in the Gospel of John, as we also see in the Book of Acts and in other places, that he's the only way to he's the only way to heaven, then what does that mean for people who never heard about Jesus or who grew up in a place where they weren't exposed to Christianity? How do we think about that? So let's delve into that question a little bit. Hey, Marcy and Rita and George, thanks for joining us together tonight. So I realize this is kind of a small list of bullet points here, but I wanted to hit on a bunch of topics. So let me kind of break these down, and then we're going to turn the corner and be delving into Islam today as a topic. So first of all, yes, I think we absolutely just have to acknowledge that the time, the space, the region you're born is going to have an influence on what religion that you are born into, that you are exposed to. I think sometimes Christians, in an effort to be super inclusive or not allow themselves to kind of get cornered into a spot where they can lose, quote unquote, lose an argument, we can quickly respond and say, no, it doesn't matter. You can know God no matter where you are. Okay, but if the question is, if I'm born in India, am I more likely to grow up as a Hindu? The answer is 100% yes. It's just more likely. That's the reality of it. That doesn't mean that there aren't lots of Christians and that God is not working. It's just the kind of cultural reality of it, right? So just like if you grow up in New Hampshire or Maine or Vermont, you're going to see the world in a particular way versus if you grow up in Florida. It doesn't mean that there's no overlap or no connection, but it's just the reality of where you live. So yes, it is an influence. However, here are some of the dynamics we should think about. First, in relation to the church, this is why world missions is so important. That's why we talk about sending the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. That's from Jesus telling his early apostles or his earlier followers in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. We're supposed to go to the whole world and bring the gospel message. And so that's why it's so important that we can bring that message around the world. That's why world missions really does matter. Second thing, Acts 17 tells us something really interesting. I shared from Acts 17, it's one of my favorite passages in the Bible, but Acts 17 a couple weeks ago in my sermon. In Acts 17, we read that God has ordained where people would live, the times and the spaces, their locations, and it says he did this that they might reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from any one of them. So that verse tells us, if we believe the Bible to be true, and I do, and I hope you do as well, then that verse tells us that God has ordained the world for people to live in certain times and places so that they would reach out to him. And then when you say, well, what if they can't find him? It says, and he's there, he's right there. He's not far from them. He's right nearby. And so God has ordained where people can live and find him. There's nobody who's going to say, I didn't know a God existed. That's confirmed there. That's confirmed in Romans chapter 1 and in Romans chapter 2 as well. Romans chapter 1 says that we know something about the Creator God by what we see in the natural world. Romans 2 is a really interesting passage because it says you have these two groups that Paul's talking about, the Jews and the Gentiles. And he says, the Jews, even though they have the law, they're not following the law. And then he says, then you have these non-Jews, the Gentiles, who are doing a better job living according to the law because they're actually willing to follow their conscience. And so he's basically giving this idea that we have a moral law within us, and we understand the idea of morality, at least in a broad sense. And so just in that setting, in the reality of like creation, what we see in the natural world around us, what we see internally in the moral law, we are exposed to the reality of God just by being human beings and living on this planet. And so just because we're born in a particular place doesn't eliminate the reality that we can truly know God. Not a particular religion, I'm not even talking about now, but actually truly come to know God. The population of the world's growth is really interesting. I heard Dr. William Lane Craig, who I refer to later on here, point out that some people say, well, think about all the people who are living in the world who don't have access to hearing about Jesus. And we say, well, that's changing rapidly and continues to change rapidly because of the technology. Many people can hear the gospel message who maybe couldn't have heard it before. And then somebody might counter and say, well, look what all those people who've lived for so many, eons and centuries before, and they never had the chance. Well, it's really interesting when you look at the population and the population growth in the world and the technology. Population growth has not been like this. It's been like this, and then it gets really steep all of a sudden. From when Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected and went back to heaven, that's like, as the population, when that happened, the population growth was at a upturn, and now from that point on, population has grown phenomenally. And so when you look at the amount of people who have lived in the history of the world, the vast majority have lived in this amount of time because population growth has been so small or so large. And in this time is when the gospel was available to people. And so God has ordained the world, it seems, that the most people would live at the best possible time to actually hear the gospel. That's just a reality of when you look at population growth and when the gospel historically was proclaimed and when Jesus lived. So I think that's an interesting reality to say the vast majority of people who've ever lived on the planet have had an opportunity to come to know God, and particularly to understand and hear the gospel. William Lane Craig delves into this topic philosophically, I think, in a really interesting way. He talks about the idea of, let me kind of take a different angle here. Let's talk about a different apologetic question. People talk about the problem of pain. What do we do with all the pain and suffering in the world? And what William Lane Craig does is he starts to parse that out and say there's the philosophical question, and then there's the emotional or existential question. Philosophically, the question or the problem of pain is actually not an issue for most philosophers as far as logic goes, because it's very easy to create a syllogism or logically say, yes, it's possible an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, and yet pain and suffering still happens in the world. That's totally feasible. It's totally a possible philosophical reality. Where we feel it is in the deep emotions of our heart and saying, yeah, but if he's good and loving, then why is this actually happening, right? So you can see how those are two different issues. One's philosophical and kind of dealing with the logic of the situation, and the other one's kind of an emotional and how do we respond to that. In the same way, when you think about the reality of philosophically what God could have done, God could have, and this is how William Lane Craig basically states it, God could have created the world in the most likely way that the most people would freely respond to his offer of forgiveness, and also ordain it that the people who would not respond to God freely, would choose to reject him from life to death, that those people would not hear the gospel message. And again, this is not a statement of fact and saying this is the way it is. William Lane Craig basically says it's possible that actually God created the world that everybody who would ever freely choose to respond to the gospel will hear the gospel. And everybody who doesn't hear the gospel, that God foreknew that these people, even if they did hear the gospel, they would reject it. Now, again, that probably doesn't like quell all our internal angst. We saw that kind of like, yeah, but is that fair question? But philosophically, he makes the case that it certainly is possible. So I think that's something to remember. The last thing I want to say here is from Jeremiah 23:5, that God is completely merciful and just. Like God is not going to be unfair at the final judgment. It does seem that you have people in the Old Testament, before the gospel is fully proclaimed, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, someone like Abram or Enoch or Moses or Elijah, who put their faith in God to the best of what they knew about God. And basically, the power of the cross is still what redeemed them, even if they didn't have a full knowledge of it. That's what brought them to redemption. One way to think about it is it's almost like those who were redeemed on credit. Like when you buy something on credit, you give a credit card. And when you give the card in, you don't have the money. You're saying, I'm going to pay this at a future time. And so you get the item now, but you pay for it at a future date. And in the same way, Moses, Elijah, Enoch, they were given salvation and forgiveness in that moment, but it was going to be paid at a future date, and it was paid by Jesus on the cross. So again, that's a couple ways that I want us just to think about this question of like, what about all the people in the world who are born in a particular place where Christianity is unpopular? Does that Does that eliminate the possibility for them to know God? Absolutely not. I will also just lastly say, you hear miraculous and wonderful stories of how God intervenes in people's lives with literally signs and wonders to expose them to the reality of Christianity. One of the interesting things about Islam is that a lot of Muslims come to faith in Christ out of dreams and visions. I mean, you have a missionary who's talking to a Muslim person, and they're kind of like, yeah, I'm not so interested. The next day they'll show up and they'll find this missionary and say, hey, I got to talk to you. I had this dream last night. Jesus showed up and said I should believe in him. I mean, like, it's crazy, amazing, miraculous things that happen. So God can reach people wherever he wants and however he wants. He is able, certainly, to do that. I actually have some friends, I can't tell you where they are right now, in the Middle East, but some missionaries over there. And one of the guys, the man over there, was approached in a Muslim country by a Muslim guy. And the guy was like, dude, I saw you in a vision and a dream, and you and I have to have a conversation because I need to learn about this whole Jesus guy. Like, and that's, again, this is the person who I'm like, I know the person enough to trust their character, that they didn't just make up a story because it's going to be fun and, like, their latest newsletter. Like, just miraculous things like that. As you dig into missiology, you'll hear more and more stories like that. So again, this is not particularly delving into Islam, but it's talking about the topic of religion broadly, and how does where you're born influence what your religion is going to be. So, we can go back and forth on that. If you have questions, feel free to contact me, tcarpenter@bethanychurch.com, and we can chat more about that. See, Brian joined us. Hey, Brian, thanks for joining us this evening. All right, so tonight's topic is Islam. We're going to dig into the topic of Islam, and as I said last week, I think it's really, really important that we remember a couple things. One is that it is never fair to critique a worldview or a religion by creating a false perception of what that religion is and then tearing it down. We want to be really accurate and precise with how we define different religions and delve into them, describing them accurately, and then saying, based on that, now let's think about what we agree or disagree about. Okay, so we want to make sure we do that. The second thing is just to reiterate what I said last week, discussing the differences and maybe even some of the shortcomings of different religions does not mean you hate everybody in that religion. It means we want to be fair and analytical and objective as we think about this topic. All right, so we're going to do that with Islam. We're going to do it with Christianity. We're going to do it with, like I said, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons in the days to come. So a great resource I want to commend to you is a book by Nabil Qureshi, who passed away a handful of years ago from stomach cancer. The book is called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and he is a convert from Islam to Christianity, medical doctor. I don't know if he finished his other PhD before he died, but super intelligent guy, powerful story, great speaker. So I want to commend that to you. If you want to read a story of somebody coming to faith in Christianity from Islam, this is a good place to go. So one of the things we have to immediately address with Islam is this idea of the image versus the reality. The question about Islam, or really any religion, is what does it truly teach in what we call orthodoxy and orthopraxy, right? We want to make sure that we are, again, understanding what the real teachings of a religion are before we say, I agree or I disagree. Orthodoxy is basically the facts and the information, the theology, what we believe. Orthopraxy is how we live out those beliefs, right? Those beliefs. It's the actions, right? So orthodoxy in the Christian faith would say, love your neighbor. Orthopraxy is me going and literally caring for my neighbors. And so when we deal with Islam, you've got this full range of what we kind of see in the media, right? You've got the extreme on one end, which is like, every Muslim is a terrorist. You have the extreme on the other end, which is every Muslim is the most loving person in the world. And the reality is, as is true with every worldview, is that it's a range of people. Now, we're going to dig into the topic of jihad and think about that a little bit tonight. But I want to make sure we're dealing with what is the Quran, what does Islam say about itself, and then step back and say, okay, what do we think about how Islam teaches about itself, right? And again, I'm beating that drum because I want us to be accurate and fair as we analyze these different world religions. So that's a key question that we're going to delve into. I want to note here that with Islam, with Buddhism, with Christianity, with Judaism, any of these religions, spending 40 minutes or 45 minutes together and looking at them is just, you're never going to be able to like fully grasp all the nuances and subtleties. I mean, I've been a Christian since I was 16, right? So I've been studying the Bible, and I've been working in full-time vocational ministry since 2005. So I've been doing this. I've been in this game for a while. And yet there's so much more I have to learn about the Bible. And I get paid in part to study the Bible. And so I want to be fair to say we're never going to fully break down and give a complete understanding of any religion in a 45-minute session, but we want to get some of the basic tenets. All right, so here we go. So Islam is the second largest religion in the world, after Christianity, with about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. It was founded around the 7th century. And right now, according to recent statistics, I would say mid-2020, it's the fastest growing religion in the world. So 1.8 billion Muslims and the fastest growing religion in the world. Now, let's talk about the word Muslim and what it means. Years ago, Jenny and I were on a whale watching trip down out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and we met this young German couple who was over in the States visiting. And we struck up a conversation, and we talked about faith and religion a little bit. And the woman actually said that on her, I believe it was her driver's license, she had to check the Protestant Christian box on her driver's license. Now, I think that's because if she got into a car accident and they wanted to bring some sort of clergy, they'd know not to get a priest, but to get a pastor instead, right? But she checked that. But as we talked, and I think even on her own admission, she was not very involved in her Christian faith. But in a box that she checked Christian, right? Take New England, for example. A huge number of people who grew up in New England are Catholic by tradition. So if you gave them a survey and said, are you Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, or Catholic? Most of them would check Catholic. So what does it mean to be Catholic? How invested do you have to be in your religion to identify as a Catholic, for example? The same thing goes for Islam and for other religions. You have 1.8 billion people who are saying, yes, I'm a Muslim. Yes, I believe in Islam. Sometimes you delve into that a little bit. You say, well, if I had to choose any box, I chose Muslim, but I don't ever really practice any of the 5 pillars. I'm not very active in my faith. I just picked that religion because that's what I identify more with than anything else. So anytime we see 1.8 billion, I think the latest numbers for Christianity were like 2.1 billion. Even that, you don't have to say, well, 2.1 billion people are following Jesus. No, it's 2.1 billion people have checked the box to identify as Christian. So let's just keep that in mind when we look at 1.8 billion people who identify as Muslims. All right, so the founder of Islam is Muhammad. And I want to note here that just as Buddha founded Buddhism, but he's not God and he's not considered God in that faith, Muhammad is the founder of Islam, but he's not the one who is worshipped, right? So he's the founder, but he is not the equivalent to God, right? So Christianity is unique in that people would say Jesus is the centerpiece of Christianity, and he is God as well. But no one is the founder per se of Christianity, like Muhammad's the founder of Islam, and Buddha is the founder of Buddhism. So important to remember that. I hear some people say sometimes like, well, the Buddhists are worshiping Buddha and the Muslims are worshiping Muhammad. And I think, no, it's actually not true. That's not who they worship. He's just the founder. And we'll talk about in a minute, the author of the Quran. So about the 7th century, 7th century is when Islam was founded. Now, the holy book of Islam is the Quran. You can see it's spelled Koran or Quran. It's the sound of it essentially is when you say it, it's going to be the same thing, Quran. The Quran is the holy book of Islam, and it's important to note that it is the source of truth for Muslims in addition to some other sources we'll talk about in a minute. The Quran is not a narrative like the historical documentation in the Old Testament or the Gospels, the book of Acts, things like that, right? The Quran is filled with kind of truths and sayings, according to the Muslims, that are applicable to your life. So again, I had mentioned this last week, I think it's much more like the book of Proverbs or Ecclesiastes than it is like the book of First Chronicles. It's not meant to be read in that same way, like a narrative of the story and the life of a particular person at a particular time. It's more kind of like, here are these eternal truths that have been revealed to humanity. So in addition to the Quran, you also have the Hadith. This is another source of truth. And these are the sayings and the stories about the life of Muhammad. And so, like we talked about orthodoxy and orthopraxy, your orthodoxy should lead to your orthopraxy. They shouldn't be separate, right? What you believe and understand theologically to be true should impact your life. And so the idea is that the Quran and the Hadith are the revelation of God, and then the life and sayings of Muhammad, and those things are supposed to match up. Now, one of the challenges one can find in Islam is when the life of Muhammad doesn't match up with the Quran. You say, okay, what am I supposed to do when I see a tension between those two things? But the hadith are very important in Islam because they tell us about the life of Muhammad, just like the Gospels would tell us about the life of Jesus. The hadith would tell us about the life of Muhammad. Okay? So Islam, the actual term Islam means submission, and the idea is it's submission to the will of Allah, the Muslim's name for God in Arabic. So Allah is how a Muslim would say God. Submission, we start to get into some interesting topics here, because depending on which line of Islam you follow or which Islamic scholar you listen to, submission is almost always about the will of the self being submitted to God. And then also certain lines of Islam would say it's about having others submit to God via Islam. And so it's a self-submission, and sometimes it's getting others to submit to Islam, right? And that's where it starts to get interesting, because there are some people say, no, it's just about self, and other people, no, it's definitely about others as well. So you have tension there, even within Islam, how different people view and live out this idea of submission. Now, in Islam, we have basically 5 pillars, and there are different core beliefs of Islam. I was listening to a Muslim scholar just earlier, and he was talking about the belief of God, about angels, about heaven. I mean, some of those big kind of ethereal concepts, right? But the 5 pillars of Islam are basically, when you get down to the orthopraxy, with a little bit of orthodoxy thrown in there. But these are the ways that Muslims live out their lives, right? These are the 5 ways that Muslims carry out their Muslim faith. And you'll note here that I wrote down, they're accepted by Muslims globally, irrespective of ethnic, regional, or sectarian differences. Like all Muslims, regardless of what they believe, I'll put it this way, the vast majority of Muslims, regardless of what angle they take on Islam, believe in these 5 pillars, 5 core realities of the Islamic faith. So let's look at these one by one. Number 1, let me give you the list first. The declaration of faith, the prayers, the almsgiving, the fasting, and the pilgrimage. Those are the 5 pillars of Islam. Now we'll break it down one by one, okay? So number 1, the declaration of faith, or the shahada. So the shahada is a fundamental statement of faith and commitment by Muslims, and the statement is this: there is no God but God, meaning Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, right? There's no God but God, who's Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. So we're going to talk about the singularity of God. We'll also talk about the role that Muhammad plays. But you cannot say, if you're a good Muslim, you cannot say there is one God, it's Allah, and Muhammad and Moses and also Tim Carpenter are his messenger, right? That would not line up with the core first pillar, right? It would be that God is one, he is Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, right? So that's the first pillar, to be able to state that and actually believe that. Number 2 is our prayers, or the prayers of Muslims, Salah. So Salah is the ritual prayer of Islam, through which all Muslims conform to the will of Allah. Prayer is performed in the direction of Mecca 5 times a day. Friday is set aside as a day for congregational prayer, also known as Jummah. So prayer is going to be central in Islam. My uncle used to work down in Washington, D.C. with an aerospace company. And he worked with a Muslim guy who 5 times a day, or maybe 3 times a day at work, and then once in the morning and once in the evening when he was not at work, he would get his prayer rug and he would go and he would face toward Mecca and he would pray. And he would pray these prayers. And the idea is that through your prayers, you're going back to this idea of submission, and you're submitting your will to God, and God is forming you, right? So you may have seen a gathering of people for congregational prayer in Islam where they're praying, they've got their heads on the floor, they're saying different prayers, they stand up, then there's kneeling again. So it's a very there's a ritual that goes into this form of prayer, and 5 times a day it's supposed to happen, right? So that's the second pillar of Islam. The third pillar is the almsgiving. Some people might think of that as like a tithe, but it's a little different, because the tithe means 10%, and this is the zakat. So the zakat, it refers to the obligatory donation of a portion of a Muslim's surplus wealth. Islamic charities encourage donors to use their services to relieve suffering and to help refugees, victims of environmental disasters, the urban poor, and conflict zones. And it comes out to about 2.5% of a Muslim's income. So 2.5%. So I heard missionary to the Muslim world one time say, like, just there, Islam's got a leg up because they're asking for 2.5%, whereas most churches are asking for 10%, right? So there is a difference. There's obviously a difference between what's expected as far as the generosity and giving of alms to the poor. Number 4 is fasting. And you probably connect the idea of fasting, if you know anything about Islam, to Ramadan, this month of fasting, right? So it's the Psalm. Muslims are expected to fast during Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. During daylight hours, which vary depending on the time of year in which Ramadan falls, they must abstain from food and drink, sexual activity, and smoking, breaking the fast with a meal after the sun sets. Those who are elderly, ill, pregnant, breastfeeding are exempt, and children are not required to participate. So it's an entire month where you're not eating during the daytime, but you're eating in the evening time. So that's one of the 5 pillars. That's number 4, 5 pillars of Islam. Again, these are things that are expected to be carried out by faithful Muslims. And then here's the last one. It's the Hajj, also known as the pilgrimage. And the idea is that completing the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is basically the holiest city in Islam, is a duty that every Muslim should perform during their lifetime. All pilgrims should be in good physical and spiritual health before they make the journey. While in Mecca, they complete a series of individual and collective actions on the various days of their visit, following the pattern set by Muhammad. So the idea is that any Muslim who wants to be a good Muslim will travel to Mecca and will engage in these particular rituals or activities. So then, again, those are the 5 pillars. Let me scroll back up here just to show you real quick. So the declaration of the faith, basically that there's one God, he's Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. The prayers 5 times a day towards Mecca, the almsgiving 2.5% in the zakat, fasting during Ramadan, and the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca. A good Muslim will carry those things out according to generally how Muslims see the theology of the Quran and the Hadith kind of put together, right? So those are the 5 pillars of Islam. Now we get to this interesting word that usually stirs up a lot of response when it comes to people in any religious perspective, when it's connected to the idea of jihad in Islam. So the idea of jihad means to struggle or to strive. And so the fundamental question a lot of people ask about Islam is that struggle internal? Is it external? Is war jihad? Is a war in jihad part of Islam? That's a really huge question for people to ask. We're going to talk about violence in Islam toward the end of tonight. And I'm going to give you some resources to dig into because, again, we don't have a chance to dig into the full understanding of Islam and its perspective on violence. And again, to be fair, just like in 10 minutes, I couldn't give you an explanation of violence in the Old Testament. We'd have to really delve in to understand how it fit into the greater context, right? So, but when you hear the word jihad, for most people, they think about the word jihadi, they think about terrorists, and yet there are Muslims who say, no, the jihad is this internal struggle. I'm battling against myself, just like I'm battling myself to submit to the will of God. I'm having this struggle or this striving to submit myself to the way that Allah wants me to live, right? So this idea of jihad, very interesting in Islam because there's questions about whether it's external, internal, or both of those things. So let's talk now about where Christianity and Islam agree, and then we're going to talk about some differences between Christianity and Islam. So here are some of the agreements between Christianity and Islam. Number 1, God exists. He's all powerful and is the creator of everything. That Christians and Muslims agree absolutely about God and his power and his grandness. I was watching a discussion between basically a Muslim sort of journalist, I think he might have been a YouTuber, and a Muslim cleric. And they were talking about basically proof of the existence of God. And I listened to it and I thought, all those examples you give, I would agree with because you're using the same rationale and logic that Christian philosophers and thinkers have used and theologians have used for a long time. So there is an overlap there. Christians and Muslims believe in an all-powerful God. Number 2, the world is filled with trouble. The world's filled with sorrow. The world's a broken place. I mean, that's the whole idea of submission and striving and struggle and changing is because there's brokenness in the world. And so there has to be kind of a battle that's going on. Now, again, what does that exactly look like? Different topic. But Christians and Muslims believe the world is not perfect. That is a difference between Christianity and Islam and maybe Judaism and some other Eastern religions where there would be this idea that like the world isn't actually as broken as you think. You just are experiencing it as broken. But when you get to a deeper level of spiritual understanding, you'll see that everything is fine. Right? That's just a different perspective. And Christianity agree that the world is a broken. Christianity and Islam agree that the world is a broken place. Number 3, There is absolutely an afterlife. This is not the only life that there is. Paradise, heaven, whatever you want to call it, there is a place after we die in these from these earthly bodies. There is a judgment that we will stand before the creator of the universe, and he will have something to say about how we lived our life, what we believed, our orthodoxy or orthopraxy. There's something to be said about how our lives are going to connect to the afterlife. Next one, we should work to bring people to our faith. Muslims and Christians, when you look at their core doctrine, are trying to draw people into a place where they come to trust and believe in that particular faith. So that is a reality for both Muslims and Christians. Agreement there. Last thing is that life is filled with not just external battles, like I said before, but there's internal battles. We are constantly struggling to become better people. Now, in Christianity, again, we would say more Christ-like. And in Islam, I think the angle would be more kind of fully submitted to the will of God, which is not the exact same thing as saying more Christ-like, right? So there are some overlap and some similarities. Now, one thing I want to be, again, really fair about is one can say for the idea of, for the sake of like, let's just be peacemakers, that basically you believe in God and I believe in God. I guess we believe the same things. But that is really important that we delve into that question. What do we mean by God? Or what do we mean by believe? And when we delve into that, now we start to see how things are actually significantly different. So these are some similarities kind of at a high philosophical level. Let's talk about some of the differences. So one of the major differences between Christianity and Islam has to do with God's nature and character, right? God is one in Islam, God is Trinity in Christianity. Now, let's talk about God's character. We use, again, the sermon that I preached a couple weeks ago, I talked about the idea God is beyond us, God is with us, and God is Trinity. So God is beyond us. That's this idea of he is transcendent. He's beyond all things. He is above all things. He's the ruler of all things. When we talk about his immanence, that means he's with us. He's close by. He's nearby. I don't have to say, God, can you hear me? Because he's right here with me, right? Now, in Islam, when it comes to God's character, God is absolutely transcendent. He is distant. And now while he might be described as merciful and loving, when you read through the writings in the Quran and the Hadith, you're not going to see the idea that God is intimately involved in human lives in the same way that Christianity describes God being intimately involved in human life. Like the idea that God would come and walk in the garden in the cool of the day and say to Adam and Eve, where are you? Why are you hiding? That is a foreign idea in Islam. The idea of God as loving father, that we could call him Abba, father, is not the same thing in Islam. So the very character of God is different in Islam compared to Christianity. And then the very nature of the Trinity. Now, this is a bit philosophical, but I think it's a really powerful argument when you think about it. And I didn't come up with it, but when you think about the nature of the Trinity and what the implications are, right? So I was sharing this with the staff the other day, and I love that I learned this someday because it really helped me frame my understanding of the Trinity. In Acts 17, the Apostle Paul says that in God we live and move and have our very being, and that God doesn't need these temples that these people were making in Athens. And it says, as if he needed anything, implying he does not need anything. Now, what does that mean? That means God is completely self-sufficient. That means God doesn't wake up in the morning and say, if Tim doesn't talk to me today, I'm going to be at a loss. He is completely content in and of himself. When Tim doesn't talk to God, God is grieved, but he's not grieved because God is losing out. God is grieved because he knows that his child, Tim, is losing out on having a relationship with him. So God needs nothing. And that connects back to this idea of love and relationship, because in the Trinity, you have the Father, Son, and Spirit who are in perfect community and communion with one another. The Father beautifully loving the Son beautifully loving the Spirit beautifully loving the Father in every possible way. Perfectly connected. They were loving and in perfect community from all eternity. And if that is true, which it is, then the desire for God and the choice for God to make humanity, to make anything, particularly human beings with whom he could have a relationship, is not because he needed to, it's because he chose to out of love and his creative power. And that's because the Trinity didn't need to make anything for relationship, because the Trinity already was relationship, community, and love in the Father, Son, and Spirit. Now contrast that with the monotheism of Islam, which if Allah is singular, there's no one like Allah, there's no one connected to Allah, there's no Trinitarian reality for Allah. If Allah was going to love and have a relationship with anything, he was obligated to make something, and therefore he needed to make something in order to have a relationship with that thing. That is not true in Christianity. There is no necessity for God, the Trinity, to make anything. It was a choice out of love and creativity to make human beings with whom he could have a relationship. In Islam, that's a total difference. The singularity of God becomes a troublesome point because now, out of necessity to have a relationship, Allah has to make something or make someone. So that's a significant difference between Christianity and the Trinity and Islam in the singular nature of who Allah is. So there's a difference we need to identify. Again, I think the beauty of the Trinity just comes shining through there compared to the singularity of Allah described in Islam. Okay, here's another area of disagreement. The role of Jesus. God in the form of man, a personal, loving, suffering God. And I remember I talked about the transcendence of God. Allah is transcendent. He's distant. He's described in the Quran as kind of beyond the veil, beyond this curtain that we can't enter into and to fully experience him. And so there's this kind of, I can't fully connect to Allah in the way that I can connect to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. Now think about this. God, the Creator, God the Father is described as Father, which there's this immediately, the word Father denotes relationship and son or daughter to a father, right? So there's relationship there. The Spirit of God described as counselor, friend, as the one who would dwell in us. Jesus says, I no longer call you servant, but I call you friend. You see, the nature, particularly of Jesus, is that he is God in the form of man, come to be with us, commune with us, suffer with us, empathize with us. See, we have a high priest who could understand our pains and our trials, even though he never gave in to any of the temptations that we face. So it's a very different view of who Jesus is. Jesus, while in Islam, Jesus is considered a prophet. There's also ways in which when the Quran says Jesus is a prophet, it says at the same time, but we don't really think he's anything that special. There's ways in which the Quran affirms the miracles and the wonder of Jesus, and there's also ways in which it denies those same miracles and wonders. So I posted an example here. In the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, he was not killed, nor was he crucified, but so it was made to appear to them. I mean, that is directly a quote out of the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. That says that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Now, take that and then contrast it with what we see in the New Testament. If Jesus didn't die, the Apostle Paul says, if he wasn't crucified and resurrected, then Paul says we are a people to be most pitied. Literally, we are pitiful. You should be full of pity when you see a Christian to go, they believe in a God who didn't die and a man, Jesus, who didn't die and didn't come back from the dead. So at some point we have to say, was Jesus the Son of God or God in the form of man who died on the cross, was resurrected, and then ascended to heaven? Or was he a prophet who just taught nice things and he performed some miracles? That's a huge difference in how we view Jesus, right? And this connects back to the idea of God when people say, well, you call it Allah and we call it Yahweh and it's the same thing, or you call it God the Father and we call him Allah, it's the same thing. But the very nature of how Christians and Muslims see God is different, because Trinitarian, first of all, versus a non-Trinitarian God. And then the nature of who Jesus is, suffering, coming to live on earth. The idea that God would become man and live on earth is I don't know if I don't know the theology enough to be fair, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was called blasphemous. That idea was called blasphemous in Islam. So there's a huge gap between Christianity and Islam in that particular issue. Here's another verse, chapter 5, verse 72. Those who say Allah, meaning God, meaning referring to Jesus here, is the Messiah, son of Mary, have certainly fallen into disbelief. The Messiah himself said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. Whoever associates with Allah in worship will surely be forbidden paradise by Allah. So those who associate with Allah, meaning Jesus, in worship are going to be forbidden from going into paradise. Their home will be the fire, and the wrongdoers will have no helpers. Now look at that opening line again. Everyone always says, let's just replace Allah with Jesus there. Jesus is the Messiah, son of Mary, have certainly fallen into disbelief. I mean, that is fundamentally, the Quran teaches, chapter 5, verse 72, that if you believe that Jesus is the Messiah and he's the son of Mary, the Quran says, no, you're wrong. You're just wrong. That's a significant difference between Christianity and Islam, and we need to acknowledge that, and we can wrestle through it and think about it, but that is a huge, huge difference between Christianity and Islam. All right, let's look at some other differences. How about our relationship with God and our salvation? Now, we talked about the relationship with God to some degree already, because we see that we can have a personal relationship with God in Christianity, indwelt by the Holy Spirit, led by the Spirit, called to walk in step with the Spirit, friend of Jesus, no longer servant. He calls us brothers or sisters, if you will. And yet Allah is totally distant, transcendent, beyond us, beyond the veil. We can't have that same type of personal interaction with him as we can with God in Christianity. Now, beyond that, we have the idea of how does one earn salvation, right? So know Jesus, love Jesus, follow Jesus, that intimate relationship versus a distant God. Are we justified by faith or by works? That's the question. In Islam, you carry out your 5 pillars. You live a righteous life with the hopes that you will eventually be considered righteous enough, and when you die, you'll go to heaven. And it really does have a lot to do with that kind of scale, more good works than bad works. Faith versus works in the idea of what leads to salvation is a strong contrast between Christianity and Islam. Christianity teaches in Ephesians 2, chapter 8, or Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. It's by grace you've been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, is the gift of God, so that no one can boast. It is the reality of trusting in the work of Jesus, not my work, in his work on the cross, that I'm saved. If you confess with Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved. Confession is not a work, it's just a statement. Believing in your heart is not a work externally, it's an internal reality. If you confess with your mouth, believe with your heart that Jesus Christ is Lord, you will be saved. Salvation comes from the confession and the belief. In Islam, it has to do with working. Those are huge differences, right? Because again, let's just think about it. If Islam is right, if Islam is correct about this, we should all be working really hard so that we can have eternity in paradise. But if Christianity is right, we also work hard, but we work hard for a different reason. We work hard in response to the goodness of God, not to earn salvation. We say, God has given me this gift of salvation. Now I want to work for him. Not I want to work so I can have salvation. Right? So again, a serious contrast between Christianity and Islam when we think about these two things. I want to talk about the idea of the revelation of Christianity and the revelation in Islam. So in Islam, the Quran was given only to Muhammad. It was revealed to Muhammad according to their faith tradition, and that was over about a period of 23 years to that one man, Muhammad. Now, whatever your stance is on Christianity, Islam, whatever it is, revealing truth to one person does take a level of believing the miraculous to a new level, because you have to believe that that person makes no mistakes. This is the same thing for Joseph Smith with the Book of Mormon, right? Receiving basically supernatural goggles so he could translate these golden tablets that are given to him by Moroni, this angel. Like, you have to have full trust in Muhammad or Joseph Smith or any other person who says, I'm the one person who received this revelation from God. Now contrast that with Christianity. And I had found this slide, which I thought was interesting. So over a period of 1,600 years, not 23, 40 different authors wrote the 66 books of the Bible. There were 400 years of silence between the 39 books of the Old Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament. And then it says, yet Genesis to Revelation tell one unified story. I would add in also that you have different authors from different times in different physical locations on 3 different continents with different backgrounds and abilities, and yet it all ties cohesively together as one story of God's redemptive work. And so when we think about the revelation of God, we all of a sudden we see that Islam and Christianity have 2 different approaches. One person, 23 years, 40 people, 1,600 years, 66 different books, 3 different continents, multiple languages, multiple generations, and yet it all is woven together. It's a pretty miraculous thing to think about. So again, a difference between Islam and Christianity. Now, a question that many people ask about Islam, and we're going to kind of move toward wrapping up here, and many people ask about Islam, is the question of, is Islam a violent religion? I can remember years ago at a Thanksgiving dinner in Maryland with my family having this debate and this discussion. It was not long after 9/11. And so the question came up about Islam and if it's actually a violent religion. And so I took the stance because I want to be true to the facts and the information, not get caught up in the moment. I took the stance and say, to make that case, we have to actually understand the theology and the teaching in the Quran and the Hadith to understand what Muslims actually believe, because we have the Quran, again, within the Islamic faith, miraculously given to Muhammad as he wrote it down. And the hadith is how he lived out the Quran. And so we look at his life and we look at the Quran and how do those things line up, and then we make a conclusion about what the teachings are. We can't just say, well, I read one verse from here in the Quran, therefore it's not a violent religion, or what read one verse and it is. I wouldn't want to do that with Christianity either. I think we need to, again, context is king, whether we're studying, whenever we're studying, particularly the Bible, but in anything, we want to remember the context of what is being shared. So if we're going to understand how violence fits into or doesn't fit into Islam, we're going to go back to the word, the idea of submission, and who is submitting to who. Am I submitting to the will of God myself? Am I making other people submit? Jihad, is it a struggle? Is it a battle for me internally? Like the Apostle Paul says, put to death the old man, or is it a jihad, an external thing, bringing people into submission to Islam? So here are some of the questions, or the things I want to get us to think about. Number one, I would encourage you to hop onto YouTube and type in Oxford Union and Islam. The Oxford Union is a location in England, as you would probably assume, where people get together and debate these very important topics, right? There's one where you have basically 4 or 5 people on one side and 4 or 5 people on the other, and they pick a topic and they debate it. And the question that I watched recently was, does God exist? And then you have somebody who stands up and says, yes, I believe God exists, and has 15 minutes to explain why. Somebody opposed to it stands up and says, no, God doesn't exist, and they explain why. And so at the Oxford Union, they had a debate about the question, is Islam a violent religion? I would encourage you to go and to dig around there and to listen to the perspectives given there, to start delving in to wrestle with this question. This is, I think, a most fundamental question for us today, because this is some of the challenge of how we engage with Islam in the world, as a Western world. How do we engage with the topic of Islam? So go and check out those Oxford Union videos over on YouTube. The second thing is we have to consider the proper application of the Quran, or the Bible for that matter, right? So when we think about violence, particularly in the Old Testament, because there is violence in the Old Testament that is condoned by God, does that mean that God always condones violence all the time? Well, obviously not. So that's why we have to go back to a proper understanding and theology of the Quran if we're going to understand if it is actually a violent religion or if it is not a violent religion. The last thing I want to point out to you, which was, again, this was shared by this Muslim missionary who came to visit in the States and presented to a group I was working with at that time. And I got to get a piece of paper to do this, actually. But he had a manila folder. And he took the folder like so, and then he opened it up. And he said, sometimes when we think about extremism, and he said, take an extreme Christian on one side, for example, somebody who's caught up in extreme right-wing KKK, let's say somebody in the KKK who identifies as a Christian but has very violent tendencies. We say, this is where one person is. And then we say, okay, let's take an extreme Muslim on the other hand, over here on the other end, so you can see this person on the other side, and they are extremely violent as well, but Islam is driving them. And so he said, the vast majority of Christians actually live here. And the vast majority of Christians live here. And the vast majority of Muslims live here. They live in this middle ground where they're not on the extremist ends. And then he went like this. The reality is the extremist Christian, and then the extremist Christian and the extremist Muslim are more similar than you would think. And he just went like that. So the theology and the worldview that drives an extremist Muslim and an extremist Christian are going to be very similar in how they interpret and understand the Bible. And I just want to point that out because it's important to be fair and to critique a religion based on what the theology says and then how the theology is actually lived out. And again, we don't have the time to dig into that in all the fullness right now. Now, let me offer you, as we wrap up here, a few hints if you're engaging with Muslim people. Number one is it is rarely effective to aggressively critique Muhammad as a start. That is not a good place to start in most cases to have a conversation because it'll create a very defensive posture in the conversation. It is probably helpful to begin at the common ground and say, just like Paul did in Acts 17, you believe in God and I believe in God. Let's talk about what God is actually like. And then the tension point is ultimately going to come up when we deal with the question of who Jesus is and what he believes or who he was. Like, how do we actually think about the teachings of Jesus? Because if he's just a prophet who performs some miracles, that's one thing. If he's the Son of God who died to offer redemption to the world, that's a totally different thing. And remember that friendship and kindness and love in conversation is such a great way to kind of like create the environment for healthy conversation to be lived out, right? So what I don't want to do is present myself as some sort of expert in doing Islamic evangelism. That is not me. I had Muslim friends when I was in graduate school and some fellow graduate students. I've done some outreach in New York City with Islamic people. To be candid with you, I went around in with a group of students one time looking for people to have conversation with, and it just didn't go that great. But hey, that was us, and other people had great conversations in their group. But that was one of my experiences. I tend to be interested in the theological and the apologetic issues when it comes to Christianity and Islam, but God's given me some friends from different religions in my lifetime, and so my experience has been kindness, care, asking good questions, and then speaking the gospel clearly, in love, and truthfully is an effective way to engage in those conversations. All right. I do have other resources on the topic of Islam. If you're interested, I'd be glad to share those with you. You can always reach out, tcarpenter@bethanychurch.com. So thanks for tuning in this evening. We're going to wrap up now 4 minutes early. Again, if you have questions, you can email me, tcarpenter@bethanychurch.com, whether it's about Islam or other world religion questions. And we're going to dig into, again, Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, maybe both of those, see some of the similarities, some of the differences next week. And then we're going to be looking at kind of the New Age movement and the religion of kind of self as God in the final week. All right. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Have a great evening, and tune in next week. All right, everybody. Take care.